Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening to the Academy's New Year reception and lecture. The beginning of the year is the right moment as well, on behalf of the whole of the Academy, Council and Executive, to thank you for all the support you've given the Academy over the last year. It certainly means a very great deal to me, so thank you. Now, tonight I've got two important functions to perform, the first of which is to present the Sir Frank Whittle Medal. This medal is awarded to an engineer for outstanding and sustained achievement, which has contributed considerably to the well-being of the nation. The award seeks to reflect the achievements and legacy of the late Sir Frank Whittle, Fellow of this Academy, famous worldwide for the invention of the jet engine. The field of activity changes annually, and this year the medal is being awarded for engineering innovations in international development. It gives me great pleasure to announce that the winner of the 2010 award, 2010 Sir Frank Whittle Medal, is Professor Sir Richard Feachem, a Fellow of this Academy. Sir Richard is one of the most distinguished engineers working in the field of global health, encompassing a whole range of diseases, including AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and waterborne diseases. He's Professor of Global Health at the University of California, Executive Director of the University of California at San Francisco Global Health Sciences. In 2007, he founded the Global Health Group, which he called an action tank, as opposed to a think tank, dedicated to bringing major new paradigms in global health through to large-scale action. This entails analysis, policy formulation, and consensus building, followed by intensive collaborations with individual developing countries to achieve large-scale application of the new ideas. Sir Richard's had an extensive career, serving previously as founding executive director of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. During this time, the Global Fund grew from scratch to become the world's largest health financing institution for developing countries, with assets of some $11 billion US, supporting 450 programs in 136 countries. Before this, he was the founding director of the Institute for Global Health at the University of California at San Francisco and the University of California, Berkeley, and the director for Health, Nutrition and Population at the World Bank. And before that, he was dean of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He served on numerous boards and committees, including chairman of the Foundation Council of the Global Forum for Health Research, treasurer of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, a member of the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, and the Commission on HIV and Governance in Africa. Sir Richard has worked in international health and development for 40 years and has published extensively. He's an honorary fellow of the Faculty of Public Health Medicine of the Royal College of Physicians and the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and he was knighted in 2007. So it gives me very great pleasure to present to you the Frank Whittle Medal. Now, there's no gift that comes without service. So my second task is to welcome you to the Academy's New Year's reception. And those of you who've been to this event in the past will know that the occasion is intended as an opportunity for fellows, partners, and special guests to meet socially, and at the same time to hear a real expert speak on a subject of broad interest with an engineering bias. So this evening, our guest speaker is Richard, and his subject is, I believe, Reengineering Aid, a bold agenda for the 21st century. But actually, if it's not, we're going to listen to what you say anyway. So I'm delighted to invite you to come and give your lecture. Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Lord Browne, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's quite an emotional reunion. And I discovered over the drinks period that I'm meeting friends and colleagues who I haven't met for over 30 years. So this really is a special evening, and I'm a little overawed by the honor that you have done to me. My talk this evening is about development and about the aid industry. And my work in development actually started in 1965, very many years ago, when I swam ashore from a small boat and landed on a beach on the south coast of Guadalcanal, which is, as you all know, I know, there will be a quiz at the end of this talk, by the way, you all know is the largest island in the Solomon Islands. And my task was to build an airstrip to establish the first civil engineering connection with my remarks this evening. And it was indeed built in the next 12 months and still has about 3 flights a week. And that's how I got started. But of course, in this career in development and in thinking about the honor you have done me this evening in awarding me the Sir Frank Whittle Medal, I'm very much aware that careers are greatly influenced by friends, colleagues, and mentors, many of whom are in this audience this evening, and I want to thank those individuals very warmly, and particularly to mention my first mentor, without whom I certainly would not be standing here this evening, and who had a great influence on me early in my career, Professor Michael Hamlin. And I want to say thank you, Michael. I can't actually see you in the audience, but there he is. A special thank you to Michael and to Guster, of course, but to all friends and colleagues who have worked with me over the years. Now, I imagine that all recipients of this medal search for improbable links between themselves and their careers and Sir Frank Whittle. And I'm going to propose 4 improbable links, 3 of which are entirely trivial and 1 of which is extremely important. The first improbable link is that I blame or thank, I'm not sure which, Sir Frank, for the fact that I spend a very large proportion of my life at 36,000 feet. But I reflect that without Sir Frank, I would spend an even larger proportion of my life at about 25,000 feet. So I am probably grateful to him. Second, my father actually overlapped very briefly at Cambridge with Sir Frank and used to speak about him. Thirdly, like Sir Frank, I married an American and moved to the United States, in case you didn't know that about either Sir Frank or about me. But lastly, and most importantly, is the whole influence that Sir Frank has had on pandemics, a subject which, because of H1N1, swine flu, is in the newspaper every day at the moment. Before Sir Frank, the shortest intercontinental journey that you could make was longer than the longest incubation period of any pandemic infection. So even if you boarded the vehicle asymptomatic, you would become ill on the voyage. Hopefully you would die, we could throw you overboard, and you would not arrive to infect the unsuspecting citizens of wherever you were going. We still had pandemics in that era, but they operated in slow motion compared to today's pandemics. Today, because of Sir Frank and Rolls-Royce and other co-conspirators, the longest intercontinental journey that we might make is shorter than the shortest incubation period of any pandemic infection. And so it's very easy to board asymptomatic, to disembark asymptomatic, to escape those very impressive fever scanners, which many of you will have seen on Shanghai or Hong Kong or Singapore airports, and to enter a country in a new continent carrying the infection but not yet ill, to subsequently infect the people who stay at your hotel or join you for dinner. And indeed, if we go back to the origins of the current H1N1 swine flu pandemic, which, as you recall, started in Mexico in March and April of 2009, it was in 100 countries in the first 10 weeks, which is a Sir Frank Whittle phenomenon. And pre-Sir Frank Whittle, it could not possibly have been in 100 countries in the first 10 weeks. So we're in an age now, and we'll see much more of this through the 21st century. We're in an age now of acute and devastating pandemics, which we could talk about more at the question and answer time. But I want to turn our attention to the aid industry, the business of aid. It's a business that's 60 or 70 years old. It is the business of transferring resources from wealthy and fortunate countries, such as the United Kingdom, to poor and less fortunate countries for the purposes of development. And it has its origins, firstly, in the Marshall Plan, and secondly, in the period of decolonization, when arrangements had to be made to support the economies of former colonies. The aid industry is implemented by two kinds of corporation, two kinds of organization: the multilateral agencies, some of which are on the right of this slide, and the bilateral agencies, some of which are on the left of this slide. The flow of funds is the same. It's from the taxpayers of the wealthy countries to the bilateral agency, in our own case DFID, whose logo you will see on the left-hand side, and from DFID, or the equivalent in other countries, either directly to the recipient country, the bilateral route, or via a multilateral agency such as the World Bank. The World Bank was founded in 1945. Its first loan was to France, and it is the grandfather of the multilateral organizations. The bilateral organizations were mainly a post-colonial phenomenon, and the two most important listed here, USAID and DFID, our own Department for International Development, were both interestingly started in 1961. Now, I want to set a very optimistic tone for these remarks, because development has been a spectacular success in our professional lifetimes in the last 3, 4, 5 decades. Poverty has gone down enormously around the world. Life expectancy has increased more in the last 50 years than in the previous 4,000 years. You have to say that many times to get your mind around it. Life expectancy has improved more since about 1960 in the last 50 years than in the previous 4,000 or 5,000 years for Homo sapiens as a whole. And fertility is way, way down. Fertility has declined rapidly over the past decades. And so, in fact, the previous high mortality, high fertility circumstance in which Homo sapiens existed has been converted in our professional lives to a low mortality, low fertility circumstance. And that will occur only once. Suppose Homo sapiens exists for 500,000 years. Let's make up a number. Only once in the history of the species will this conversion, hopefully irreversible, from high mortality, high fertility to low mortality, low fertility, only once will it occur. The majority of it has occurred in the lifetime of the people in this room, and the rest of it will occur in the next 15, 20 years. Africa is the holdout, but mortality is falling and fertility is falling in Africa. So it's happening there as well. But the question for this evening is, why was that? And in particular, was it because of aid, to some degree or largely? Was it irrespective of aid? Was aid irrelevant to this historic transition? Or was it despite aid? Would it have happened more rapidly if we had had no thing called the aid industry? And that's the territory I want to explore with you. So let's look at aid, and let's look at that part of aid called ODA, Official Development Assistance. This is the taxpayers of wealthy countries giving money through their taxes to their government, in our case DFID, who then give it either bilaterally or multilaterally to purposes of development in developing countries. And the blue line is total ODA since 1960, measured in constant dollars, and you can see it's gone steadily up. And in total, since 1960, we have distributed about $3.5 trillion worth of aid from the wealthy countries to the poorer countries. The red line is the generosity line, because that is aid expressed as a percentage of the GNI, the gross national income. Those of you more familiar with GDP, think of GDP, roughly the same thing. It's a percent of the GNI of the countries giving the aid. So it's a measure of generosity. And what's interesting there is from 1960 to about 1970, the left-hand side of the red line, you see the effect of colonialism. You see that colonialism was quite expensive. And there was a dramatic fall in the percent of GNI given to ODA as countries decolonized and shook off the colonial master. Then there was a flat period, then there was a fall, and now it's coming up. And as some of you will be aware, there is an international agreement to try and get ODA up to about 0.7% of GNI of the wealthy countries. And we're probably at around 0.33, 0.34 at the moment. Now let's look at those generosity lines by country and look only at the right-hand side. Don't worry about the left-hand side. Look at the right-hand side. And these, again, are percentages of GNI allocated to ODA by a selection of the major donor countries, the wealthy countries that give the ODA. And what you see here is that there's a generous group and a less generous group. So at the top of the right-hand side, you have the generous group. And who are they? They are the Scandinavians and the Dutch. And they are the generous group. They're above 0.7% of GNI. Some of them are above 1% of GNI. And in a number of those countries, that's the law of the land. They cannot fall below that figure without an act of parliament. So it's recession-proof to a degree. The lower group are the less generous countries, of which the United Kingdom is currently the most generous of the less generous group, and the United States is among the least generous of the less generous group. But bear in mind that in terms of absolute dollars, the US is by far the largest donor in the world because its economy is so much bigger than anyone else's. But as a proportion of its national wealth, it is among the least generous. And the new Congress may be about to make it even less generous. We'll come back to that issue. Now, the conventional wisdom is that this is all an incredibly good thing, and we should do more of it. The group that convenes the donors is the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, in Paris, and it has something called the Development Assistance Committee, DAC, which is where the donors meet and discuss policy. And the Secretary General of the OECD said in April of 2010, aid is a vital investment with big returns for the world as a whole. And the question is that true? It's widely believed, it's widely touted, including by me, for about 40 years, and particularly while I was building the Global Fund. But is it actually true? So let's come to the aid debate. There is a huge debate going on about the truth of that statement and all the details that lie behind that statement. And I think of a boxing match. And in the left corner, which I'm going to paint red, in the red corner, we have Jeffrey Sachs, the celebrity macroeconomist, a good friend of Neelam and myself. I've worked with him closely, a very smart guy with a compelling argument. And his argument, in my words, not his, is aid is good, and more aid is better, and much, much more aid would be much, much better if we spend it in the right way. And in the opposing corner, the right corner, the blue corner perhaps, we have Bill Easterly, the champion of the counter opinion. And again, in my words, aid doesn't work, he is saying to us, and aid does harm. And in that environment of very heated debate, we have some inconvenient truths, which I'll mention to you. And we have two umpires, On the right, our very own Paul Collier from Oxford University, and on the left, Stephen Radlett, now Hillary Clinton's senior advisor for these matters. And then more and more powerfully on the scene, we have the voices of the new generation of thinkers in Africa. On the left, Dambisa Moyo, who you've been hearing on television quite a bit in the last few days in the UK, and on the right, John Gitongo. And I will come back to Dambisa and John a little later. So let's go back to Jeff Sachs. This is the argument in favor of aid and more aid and the goodness of aid. The key book is The End of Poverty, Economic Possibilities for Our Time, published in 2005. A quote from that book: "Extreme poverty is a trap that can be released through targeted investments." And Jeff argues very powerfully for what aid can do if we spend it in the right way. And it's quite a seductive argument. Let me just give you one line of reasoning that you'll hear from Jeff a lot. You'll also hear it from Bono and from Bob Geldof and from many others, and from myself over many years. Roughly 7 million children die in the developing world per year with no reason, totally preventable and avoidable. That is a tragedy. They could be saved with simple primary care. The extra investment would be $25 billion a year. The extra money on top of what we're already spending would be about $25 billion a year. And it's easily raised, surely. The Afghan war costs $100 billion a year. Bankers' bonuses in 2009, and watch out for 2010, were more than $20 billion. US annual healthcare spending on the citizens of the United States is a staggering $2.5 trillion a year. That's what US citizens spend on their own health every year. A 0.005% tax on currency transactions, sometimes called the Tobin tax, much discussed at the moment, would raise an additional $30 billion a year. Global expenditure on pet food is outrageous, and so on and so on. A very compelling argument. What's holding us back? Why don't we do this? Why don't we save those 5 million children? The argument goes. It's compelling. You can get swept away on that logic. But William Easterly and others, but let's come now back to Bill Easterly, formerly of the World Bank, now of New York University, author of several books and papers, most recently in book form, The White Man's Burden, 2006, a compelling argument about how all this is not working and in fact doing harm. One quote: "Aid won't make poverty history, only self-reliant efforts of poor people and societies themselves can end poverty." And an eloquent and well-argued case for the damage that aid does and for the lack of relationship between aid and positive outcomes in the developing countries. So let's look at some economic truths. I've characterized the polarity of opinion. Jeff Sachs on the one hand, Bill Easterly on the other hand. Let's look at some inconvenient truths that occupy the space in which this argument goes on. First, what do macroeconomists and their fellow travelers, econometricians, think about this? Well, for a macroeconomist, the key question is, can I find a plausible relationship between aid flows and economic growth? Because that's what I want to see. I know that economic growth is what is going to bring improved human well-being to developing countries. So can I find that relationship? And particularly, can I find a relationship between aid flows and economic growth per capita? Because that is really telling me something about genuine improvements in welfare. There have been many such studies. The literature combined is called the aid effectiveness literature. If I was summarizing the results of all those studies, I would say they're on a spectrum between a small relationship found by some and no relationship found by others. One of the most convincing and comprehensive of the recent studies by Rajan and Subramanian, published in 2008, is summarized in this quotation: "We find little robust evidence of a positive or negative relationship between aid inflows and economic growth. We also find no evidence that aid works better in better policy or geographical environments, or that certain forms of aid work better than others. And then I love the modesty of the conclusion. Our findings suggest that the aid apparatus will have to be rethought. Well, with a finding like that, on the back of the transfer of $3.5 trillion over 60 years, you would have to surely ring an alarm bell. Something is seriously wrong if you can't find better evidence than that. Inconvenient truth number one. But what about the Millennium Development Goals? These very concrete and specific. Let's move away from the macro, economic growth per capita. Let's look at specific things. How many girls are in school? How are we doing in the fight against HIV/AIDS? What's happening with maternal mortality? The specific goals that make up the UN Millennium Development Goals, which drive a lot of aid decision-making at the current time, and drove the birth of the Global Fund, which I had the honor to lead for its first 5 years, and drove the fact that the Global Fund started in 2002 with $0 and today has assets of about $33 billion. So that's remarkable. And it was on the back of a conviction that we could invest to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Well, a recent study by the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., has looked at a composite indicator of how well countries in Africa are doing in achieving the several Millennium Development Goals, and by using an aggregate index across all those Millennium Development Goals, has determined the best performers, and there they are, and the worst performers, and there they are, on this aggregate index. And the rest of the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa are strung out between the good performers on the left and the poorer performers on the right. And so they asked the question, can we find an association, again, between aid flows and performance against these micro-targets, these focus targets, the Millennium Development Goals? And the answer was disappointing. Performance does not correlate with aid inflows. Inconvenient truth number three, very little spoken about until this chap found his voice. Andrew Natsios, previously the head of the World Food Programme, one of the largest aid agencies in the world, and then under President Bush, the head of USAID, the largest bilateral agency in the world, now a free man, able to write and speak as he thinks fit, writing about this extraordinary conflict within agencies between the development purpose and the accounting for funds. And his quote here is, one of the little understood but most powerful and disruptive tensions in established aid agencies lies in the clash between the compliance side of aid, which he calls the counter-bureaucracy. These are the people trying to make absolutely sure that every dollar is accounted for and that there is no leakage or failure to account among the recipients. The clash between that function and the technical and programmatic side. And from my own experience, and from experience in advising and working with many aid agencies, including the World Bank, I know how severe that clash of cultures is between those who want to get the money out there and get the job done, and those whose job is to police the way in which the money is spent and ensure that every receipt for every gallon of petrol put into every Toyota Land Cruiser to transport somebody up country to do an HIV treatment clinic is actually properly receipted and accounted for. And of course, one is searching for that level of accountability in countries with extremely frail bureaucracies. And it is a very difficult thing to reconcile. But it isn't new. 8 years before this building was built, to give you a factoid, 8 years before this building was built, on the 11th of August, 1812, the Duke of Wellington was proceeding from having defeated Napoleon in Portugal, and he was on his way to Madrid to defeat the French armies in Spain. And on this particular evening, you can imagine him highly frustrated in his elaborate tent. He wrote to his masters in Whitehall as follows: We have enumerated our saddles, bridles, tents, and tent poles, and all manner of sundry items for which His Majesty's government holds me accountable. I have dispatched reports on the character, wit, and spleen of every officer. Each item and every farthing has been accounted, with 2 regrettable exceptions for which I beg your indulgence. Unfortunately, the sum of 1 shilling and 9 pence remains unaccounted for in one infantry battalion's petty cash, and there has been a hideous confusion as to the number of jars of raspberry jam issued to one cavalry regiment during a sandstorm in western Spain. This reprehensible carelessness may be related to the pressure of circumstances, since we are at war with France. I request elucidation of my instructions from His Majesty's government so that I may better understand why I am dragging an army over these barren plains. I construe that perforce it must be one of 2 alternative duties as given below. 1, to train an army of uniformed British clerks in Spain for the benefit of accountants and copyboys in London. And you can hear the contempt in his voice when he speaks of accountants and copyboys in London. Or perchance, to see to it that the forces of Napoleon are driven out of Spain. I shall pursue either with the best of my ability, but I cannot do both. Your most obedient servant, Wellington. Well, there may be an occasion when Andrew Mitchell has to write a letter like that to some parliamentary committee. But be that as it may, it is a serious tension in the business of aid as we currently practice it. And the only way out of it is the much advocated now, but little practice, cash-on-delivery aid, where you forget about the inputs, you set a fair price for the outputs or the outcomes, and you pay against the outcomes and the outputs. That clinic is built, it's worth X dollars, the check is in the mail. 600 new people are on HIV antiretroviral therapy. Each one of those is worth so many $100 a year. The check is in the mail. You audit the outcomes, not the inputs, and you pay against the outcomes. We've been talking about this for 10 years. The Global Fund does it to a degree and could do it better, and few other agencies have made serious moves in this direction. But it's the only real way to square this circle. In other words, you say to the Duke of Wellington, just beat Napoleon, and we'll give you a whole heap of cash to pay for what it cost. Inconvenient truth number 4, exemplified by India. I mention India because I'm married to India and have a particular relationship with India, but I could mention other countries. India is the largest recipient of UK aid. 70% of all aid to countries goes to India. It's the largest recipient of aid from everywhere for health. It's a very major aid recipient. But why is that? We should stop and think a bit more about the rationale for that, the commonsensicalness or otherwise of that. Those in favor will say, oh, because India has many, many poor people. Which is true. India does have many, many poor people. In fact, India has about the same number of very poor people as the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. But is that a reason to make it the largest recipient of aid? India spends less than 1% of its own GDP on health. This is a scandal. And we aid and abet that scandal by paying for health programs in India that lets the Indian government off the hook and allows them to spend about the lowest proportion of GDP on health of any country in the world. That is a scandal, and we aid and abet that scandal. As you know, in the UK we spend 9%. This year in the US we're going to spend 17, maybe 18%. 5-6% would be a good number for India. Less than 1%, inexcusable. India's defense budget is $30 billion a year. This is a very big poor country, and so it has substantial resources. Following President Obama's visit, India just decided to purchase 10 Boeing C-17 Globemasters. I've no idea what they are, but they sound very impressive. And I can tell you that they're extremely expensive. India will spend $5.8 billion of its domestic resources on those planes. And to put it mildly, there is no shortage of local knowledge, science, or management skills to allow India to solve its own problems. My wife and I live in San Francisco. The biotech industry in the Bay Area is dominated by very smart Indians, and Silicon Valley wouldn't exist without very smart Indians. India is not short of the capacities to solve its own problems and is well aware of them. And lastly, and this refers back to the less than 1% figure, aid to India is not additional. If we give $100 to the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Finance takes $100 of Indian money out and spends it somewhere else. We're not actually adding to health expenditure in India, we're merely replacing domestic expenditure, and that's not the deal. That's not how we thought it should be, and it's not how many Indians think it should be either. Inconvenient truth number 5, excuse me. The Chinese are coming. And how? Watch this space. In 2009, from being almost invisible in Africa not so long ago, China is now super active in Africa. In 2009, $2 billion of Chinese aid and $7 billion in aid-related loans to Africa, sweeping away carefully arranged structures which the conventional donors, the traditional donors, have built or are building. I won't bore you with the details, but those here in the aid business know very well how carefully constructed these arrangements have been, the Paris Declaration, untied aid, local sourcing, etc. China sweeps all those away and ignores those arrangements entirely and is becoming a very significant donor playing by another rule book. Africa is loving this, and you'll see that in a moment in the slide I'm just going to show. And it is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. So for the many engineers in the audience, and particularly the civil engineers, most of this Chinese money is going for roads, railways, ports, bridges, telecommunications, rural electrification, things that the Western donors have neglected since about 1980, creating this infrastructure deficit. Prime Minister Blair's Commission on Africa report drew attention to that infrastructure deficit. The Chinese have arrived and are plugging it in a very vigorous way. So what does Africa think about this Chinese arrival? Well, everything you can imagine. There are many different African opinions about this. But one way to determine diplomatic opinions about this is to use our very new research tool called WikiLeaks, which can be searched for all kinds of purposes, not only the purposes you read about in the newspaper. And here is some traffic from the US ambassador in Beijing reporting back to the State Department in Washington about his discussion with African ambassadors in Beijing concerning their views of Chinese aid in Africa. And what he reports, this is the US ambassador speaking to Washington about his soundings with African ambassadors in Beijing. He says, China's fast, efficient, no-strings-attached bilateral approach is popular in Africa, as is the Chinese preference for infrastructure. African officials fear that US or European interference will slow down assistance and tie conditions to Chinese aid. And there are more quotes of that kind in WikiLeaks, including some very entertaining quotes from the Kenyan ambassador in Beijing. Inconvenient truth number 6, which I call another brick in the wall, brick being, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Today, 5 countries provide 60% of ODA. Now, if I was speaking to you in 1945, in the middle of the last century, that might have seemed about right. Out of the 210 countries in the world, 60% of all ODA comes from only 5 countries, because we lived in a dichotomous world in the middle of the last century. There were a very small number of very wealthy countries, and there was a very large number of very poor countries. The world was dichotomous. It was the developed world and the developing world. The world is not like that anymore at all. And for the 21st century reality to be that 5 countries provide 60% of all ODA, China is beginning to change that, but it's still small, and not much has happened yet to really shift those numbers, is an extraordinarily outdated dynamic for these relationships. Where are the Asian tigers, absent without leave? Where are the members of BRIC, other than the Chinese? Well, they're there rhetorically, but they're not there with their money. And where are the oil-rich Middle Eastern countries? They do some things. But you know, when the Pakistani earthquake happened, we've forgotten that. The Pakistani earthquake, not the more recent Pakistani floods. And when the Pakistani floods happened, and we've almost forgotten those, and again, the same 5 countries rushed to try and support Pakistan, the co-religionists in the Middle East were remarkably passive in the face of that disaster in rural Pakistan. And that happens time and time again. Inconvenient truth number 7. I give the example of the health sector here. I don't know whether this is true in other sectors, but I know that it's true in the health sector as a result of a study published on April the 19th. There was a press conference in London. $1 of aid into a Ministry of Health across the developing world causes $0.4 to $1.1 to be removed by the Ministry of Finance from the Ministry of Health. So what we think we're doing is adding to the total of health expenditure in that country. In fact, we're not doing that. We're allowing the Ministry of Finance to withdraw money, and I hear you say, well, if he spends the money he withdraws on female education, then that's really good, isn't it? We can all be happy with that outcome. But we have no way of knowing whether he spends the dollar withdrawn on female education, and we're also putting money into the Ministry of Education. And that might have zero additionality also. So this is a real challenge, and what shocked me was that after the press conference in London on April the 19th, where these results were presented and discussed at length, there wasn't a murmur. Most newspapers didn't pick it up, and there has been no repercussions from this finding, which I find quite extraordinary. And let's look at Africa. Let's look at the period 1999 to 2006, period that we happen to have good data for. The red countries are countries that reduced their health expenditure during that period, their domestic health expenditure. So domestic health expenditure as a proportion of their national wealth went down in all the red countries. The great majority of the red countries are highly aided, and they were taking their own money out as donors were putting their money in. And why does this matter? It matters because the starting point is 10, 15, 20, 30 dollars per capita per year. It's incredibly low, the health sector spending. In the United States, outrageously, we spend $8,000 per capita per year on health. No one is recommending that Africa or anyone else spends $8,000 per capita per year on health, but a few $100s per capita per year on health is a necessary condition to run a halfway decent basic health service and to deal with the major causes of premature mortality and chronic disease. These are countries that are typically spending $10, $20, $30 per capita per year, and as the aid money flows in, domestic money comes out, and they actually reduce their domestic expenditure. The blue countries, who need a round of applause, are increasing their domestic expenditure as aid flows in, and good for them, but you see it is the minority of countries. Why isn't there much more debate about these things? And inconvenient truth number 8, the one that I will end my list of inconvenient truths on, is that this hopelessly romantic idea, and having been in this business for 45 years and traveled to many, many countries and had numerous conversations in numerous villages and numerous slums and many dinner parties with educated elites and many interactions with ordinary local people in remote rural areas or in incredibly squalid urban conditions, I know for certain that we buy no hearts and minds with our aid, and that how we're regarded in the world and our relationships with different parts of the world depend entirely on a set of other things which we might discuss, and not at all on whether that clinic down the road happened to be built by USAID or whether that doctor or nurse happened to be trained as a result of a grant from DFID or whatever it may be. We buy no hearts and minds with our aid, and let's not kid ourselves that we do. So now the voices from Africa, and some of you will have been reading these voices, and I don't agree with everything they say, but I think they really, really, really need to be listened to, and we're going to hear a lot more from these individuals and many others like them. This is the young, highly educated new generation of African leaders speaking out. And one of the most powerful spokespersons is Dambisa Moyo, the author of the book Dead Aid, subtitled Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. She's a Zambian. She has a degree from Harvard. She has a PhD in economics from Oxford, and she worked for Goldman Sachs for many years. And a quote from her book, "Aid has been an unmitigated political, economic, and humanitarian disaster for most parts of the developing world." So she's not mincing her words. And these voices are getting louder. I showed a picture earlier of John Gitongo. And for those of you who haven't read the book, It's Our Turn to Eat, I recommend that book. It's about John Gitongo and his work in Kenya and the aid industry in Kenya. Please read It's Our Turn to Eat. And you won't agree with everything, and you won't accept every fact as true, and you won't accept every analysis as being perfectly conducted. But you will hear a voice from Africa, which I hear more and more in my travels, which really has to be attended to. And that voice says, aid has been doing considerable harm. It needs to be done extremely differently or not at all. Now let me come to the umpires, the men of extreme reason and balance sitting in the middle. Firstly, our very own Paul Collier from Oxford University, the book I recommend, 2007, The Bottom Billion. And to try to encapsulate Paul's extensive wisdom, we need to narrow the target and broaden the instruments. What does he mean by that? He means focus aid on a smaller number of countries in a really, really desperate plight, and broaden the instruments in terms of trade and economic policies particularly. Do not think that funding the next health project or funding the next education project is the best way to help those countries. Look for a broader set of instruments. So narrow the target, broaden the instruments is Paul's message. Another very wise person sitting in the middle of the argument is Stephen Radlett, now Hillary Clinton's senior advisor on global development matters, and his brand new book, 2010, called Emerging Africa. His conclusion, aid is not the most important driver of growth and development. It is secondary to capable leadership, good governance, peace and stability, and sensible economic and social policies. And what he does is very interesting. He breaks Africa up into its countries, as we should all do. We far too often talk about Africa as if it's a single thing. Of course, Africa is not a single thing. It's 45 very different countries with different histories, different cultures, and different trajectories in development. And by looking at the countries of Africa separately, he discovered that between 1996 and 2008, 17 countries have had growth rates per capita of more than 3%. That's quite remarkable. A more than 3% per capita per year growth rate over a period of 12 years, leading to a cumulative average growth across all those countries of 50% per capita. So taking out the effect of population growth. So that is a remarkable upward trajectory, and it was the experience of the blue countries on that map. The blue countries on that map that he calls the emerging countries of Africa have had this more than 3% annual growth per year for a 14-year period, a 12-year period, and have emerged above the pack, have emerged with an extremely different set of performance indicators to the countries in Africa as a whole. And some of those average growth rates have been a good deal more than that 3% cutoff. For example, Botswana with a 4% average growth rate, and Mozambique with a over 5% average growth rate per capita. And he looks in detail at why that might be. What distinguishes the 17 emerging countries from the rest of the 45 countries of sub-Saharan Africa? And his diagnosis is as follows. 1, democratic and accountable government appears to make a big difference. 2, sound economic policies make a big difference. 3, the end to the debt crisis. And this is a victory for the aid industry. This is a victory for Bob Geldof and Bono and Make Poverty History and the One campaign, who said, get rid of the debt. Remember the huge campaign in the late 90s and early this century, get rid of the debt. And in Radlett's analysis, getting rid of the debt made a big difference. The spread of new technology is clearly driving entrepreneurship and new wealth in Africa, a new generation of leaders in government, the private sector, and civil society. Aid played a secondary role in the successful countries and did not rescue the rest. That would be his conclusion. Now, I've hidden behind a lot of other people's opinions. So at this point, based on, I guess, mainly my experience, but also, of course, all the things that I read and the research that I've done, I come out here. Aid has done much to create focused, irreversible change, with smallpox eradication perhaps being the only example that I can think of. And that was a huge achievement. And it's also done much to create focused but reversible change, such as HIV treatment, child immunization, and malaria control. Baroness Jay is in the audience and has had a strong link to this work. So let me just mention the HIV story very briefly. In 2000, so recently, in 2000, nobody in the developing world was on antiretroviral therapy. Nobody, except a few wealthy people in the urban centers, and they would be taking 20 pills a day, and it would be costing more than $15,000 a year. Today, there are 5 million people in the developing world on antiretroviral therapy. They take 1 pill a day, and it costs under $200 a year. It is a miracle. In my professional life in global health, I have seen no transformation as rapid and as impactful as that. And it's aid-driven. So when I say we've created focused, big impacts, HIV treatment is a good example, because the great majority of those 5 million people who are on antiretroviral therapy today, and are therefore living for many decades beyond how long they would otherwise live, it's paid for by the donors. It's paid for primarily by the Global Fund and by PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief that President Bush established. So it's paid for by the US taxpayer and then a lot of other taxpayers in the North through the Global Fund. But it is reversible, and we have to worry an awful lot about that. We have created a massive dependency. And how many people in the developing world should be on antiretroviral therapy today? Probably 15, 16, 17 million. 5 million are. The gap is enormous, and the number who need to be on therapy rises and rises and rises. Is all that to be paid for by the taxpayers of the wealthy countries? Not possible. Even without a global financial recession, not possible. With a global financial recession, certainly not possible. But are we having the grown-up discussion with the government of South Africa, with the government of India, with the government of countries with large numbers of HIV-positive people on treatment paid by the taxpayers of the wealthy countries? No, we are not having those discussions. And this dependency is going largely unaddressed. That's a big issue. Aid has done little, in my view, to drive economic growth or long-term broad and deep improvements in human welfare. And aid has done harm by encouraging and or perpetuating dysfunctional governance and policies. In country after country, we can see, it's hard to prove, but I believe we can observe the perpetuation of a dysfunctional regime or an anti-growth syndrome set of economic policies, because aid is just about keeping it turning over, and therefore politicians are not held accountable. rural Kenyan children get free education because of DFID, while politicians in Kenya are looting far more money from the national exchequer than DFID is giving for rural education. It's this kind of moral hazard, perhaps, certainly perverse consequence that we have not sufficiently shone a light on. Now, I hear you thinking, particularly those of you who are experienced professionals but not in the aid business, have not been part of the 60-year history that I've been describing to you. You must be thinking, with these results on low return on investment, low social return on investment, coming from the macroeconomists, and with these loud and strident criticisms of the aid industry, surely there have been massive reforms. Surely the stakeholders of the aid industry, whoever exactly they may be, have held the managers to account and have created major change in order to create a better circumstance. And that is remarkably not true. If the aid industry was a private corporation, the shareholders and the board of directors would have sacked the senior management team several times over these decades and demanded a change in the business model, demanded a fundamental re-engineering to guarantee a better return on investment and a better story that could be honestly told to the taxpayers of the wealthy countries. This has not occurred. And the aid industry remains remarkably unchanged since the 1960s, with three exceptions. There have been three major innovations. The Global Fund, Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And one of the disappointments to me is that although each of those very new, very different, very radically innovating organizations have demonstrated some significant improvements in how to do this, they are little studied and understood and little adopted by the mainstream and established agencies. So we're not learning from these lessons or building on them and doing even better. And in fact, there's a current trend for some of these new organizations to actually revert to the mean and to become more like the traditional organizations whose performance has not been as good as the performance of these organizations. So we really need to let the data speak. Now, I've spoken about the technical aspects of this. What about the politics of this? The technical aspects of this are challenging. Let me mention a few of those and then come briefly at the end to the political aspects. I'm not proposing tonight, nor could I possibly, a complete new model for the aid industry. That's absolutely beyond my intelligence and beyond my competence. But I am advocating for some fundamental reform and rethinking. And I am going to put on the table now a few elements of what I think a new structure might contain. So these are some building blocks for what a new structure might look like. I'm calling this the Bold Aid Reform Agenda, and I have, I think, 5 of these building blocks to propose. The first, which I haven't referred to at all so far, except in my comment about Pakistan earthquakes and Pakistan floods, is the acute disaster, the humanitarian disaster. The thing about these events is we know they're going to happen. We don't know who's going to suffer. We don't know where they're going to be. And we don't know whether it will be an earthquake or a mudslide or a flood or a tsunami. But we know that in 2011 there will be several of them. And in 2012 there will be another several. It's just the exact nature of them and location of them that we don't know. And we are extraordinarily incompetent when these things happen. And all the studies on Haiti, which are hitting the press a year after their big earthquake, are telling us how the promises have been broken, how slow the reconstruction is, and how badly we do this. What are some of the elements of doing this better? I suggest a few here. It's a complex area. Firstly, I would advocate separating humanitarian disaster relief from development assistance. They're totally different enterprises. One is very acute and very infrastructure heavy. The other is chronic, long-term, and much more policy rich. develop more coordinated and rapid response, make full use of military hardware. In many of these disasters, we need hospital ships. Who has hospital ships? Only the military. We need lots and lots of helicopters. Who has lots and lots of helicopters? Well, BP does, but the military has even more. So we need to coordinate, as we did with Haiti, but we need to do it more and more routinely with military capacity, also in logistics, supply, and peacekeeping. And be clearer and tougher on the responsibility of the host country, the rules of engagement, and the rules of exit. And make it a separate enterprise, and let's do it really, really well. And we will save hundreds of thousands of lives, and we will repair more quickly millions of livelihoods. Number 2, focus on the non-aid development agenda. A quote from Steve Radlett: "Aid is not the most important policy tool rich countries have to influence growth and development. Much greater influence comes through trade and investment policies." We say this, and some of the NGOs advocate for this, but we don't do very much. The G20 in South Korea had one big development topic, and that was DFQF, which is the aid business acronym for duty-free, quota-free. Let the low-income countries have duty-free, quota-free access to the markets of the rich world. We're very far from that. The United States, which in many ways is a paragon of free trade, and certainly likes to wag its finger at the world about the benefits of free trade, is appallingly protective in the two areas that matter most, agriculture and textiles. And if you look at subsidies, quotas, and duties in the US in agriculture and textiles, you can quickly see the damage they do to the economies of the low-income countries. So let us focus on these kinds of policies, not just the volume of money that DFID can make available to its client countries. Number 3, innovation, 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 and particularly innovation financially. More equity investment, less debt, more blending of public and private investments. David Pitts is in the audience, a very experienced and senior banker who has spoken eloquently about these matters. More public-private partnerships, more allowing small amounts of public money to alleviate risk and to provide comfort, so that much larger amounts of private money at reasonable interest rates or private equity investments can be made to flow. And by the way, by so doing, you will create situations where you're investing in the private sector and not just pouring money into governments that are already probably far too large and certainly not effective in many of their implementation challenges. So a lot more innovation. Fourthly, and I think this is the one I would put in the biggest flashing lights, scale down aid to countries and scale up aid to global public goods. We could talk for hours about global public goods, but they are things that the world really, really needs that cannot be produced or created by the activities of any one country. They have to be created by the combined investment and activity of many countries, and they will bring benefits to everybody. That is a global public good. And science of all kinds, technology, knowledge, training are global public goods. Attenuating existing global threats, drug resistance, food scarcity, climate change, the list goes on, and preparing for new global threats. I started by mentioning pandemics. The 21st century will be a century of devastating pandemics, and we are unprepared, to put it mildly. We have got away with H1N1 by the skin of our teeth. But when we get some hybrid between H1N1 and H5N1, we will be knocked over. Deaths, 300 million. Around the world in 20 weeks, 30 weeks. Total overwhelming of health services, even in the most wealthy countries. It will be a disaster. And it's going to happen. It's only a question of when, because the viral reassortment is happening so frequently. The mathematics are stacked against us. We're not ready. Water scarcity, the list could go on. Let me just hold up this. This is the wonder drug that treats malaria. In 80 countries in the world, this is first-line malaria treatment. It's called artemisinin combination therapy. It's a combination of an ancient Chinese herb together with a modern drug. It has 0 side effects, and in 3 days you are completely cured. This is a great drug, and 80 countries are using it. But on the Thai-Cambodian border and on the Thai-Burmese border is early and compelling evidence of resistant parasites, the malaria parasite becoming tolerant to this drug. And that's where all malaria resistance to drugs came from in the past. It's where it's coming from again today, and it can spread very rapidly. So there is a global public bad out there, the opposite of a global public good, which is drug resistance to this. And to contain it and stamp it out requires a massive international effort. And that would be a very worthy purpose for aid from which everyone will benefit in the malarious world and the non-malarious world, because we visit the malarious world to trade, for education, for tourism, etc. Reform agenda number 5. There are some countries in the world that are so small and so poor. Here I've got GNI per capita of less than $600 per year and a population of less than 20 million. Those are arbitrary cutoffs, but I just chose those. There are 14 countries in the world that have both those properties. They are that poor and that small. There they are. Some of those countries, and some countries like them, would cease to exist as organized nation states if there wasn't this constant and substantial flow of money from the north. The countries would just fall to pieces. And so we do need very particular new ways which contain the right incentives to keep alive, if you like, nation states that are struggling and would slip backwards very rapidly if the tap was turned off. So this is a special situation, but as Paul Collier argues, it's a very small minority of all the developing countries. And my last element of bold agenda and for reform is leadership, 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 leadership. A low-income country like the United Kingdom needs tens of thousands of people, men and women, from whom the leaders of politics, the leaders of the private sector, the leaders of the community, the leaders of the NGO movements can be drawn. It needs that pool. And that pool comes primarily from the local universities, just as our pool comes from our universities. And we have spent 6 decades neglecting investment in African universities and elsewhere, so that most African universities, a few exceptions, are in a sorry state today. They are picking up, but conditions are not good. The quality of education is not good. The motivation and training of the professors is not good. And so the brightest and the best go abroad and often stay abroad. And the strengthening of those tertiary institutions to build that leadership pool in these countries is of extreme importance. And I hear my colleagues and friends in Africa speaking about this a lot, and equally in other parts of the low-income world. We can do a lot about that. For example, we can create well-funded, long-term, co-managed marriages between northern and southern engineering schools, medical schools, and management schools. A number of African countries have more MDs, using US parlance, medical doctors, than MBAs. Now, I don't want to flood the world with MBAs, and we all have our MBA jokes, but you need managers to run a country, and you need people well-trained in management. They are in very short supply. So marriages between engineering schools, medical schools, and management schools are really important. And more development-related fellowships for study in the UK with support for return. We did more of this in the past than we do today, and I think it's incredibly important. But what about the politics? So I've mentioned some of the technical building blocks that might be part of a rethought aid industry, but the politics will be really, really hard, partly because people like me have spent decades in the business as it currently is and tend to be passionate advocates for continuing the business as it currently is, with only minor reforms. And I think the politics will come down to individual country realities, and particularly to the idea that no good crisis should go unwasted. I think we need to do this even if we hadn't had a global financial crisis. But the fact that we are in a global financial crisis makes these reforms more important. And let me illustrate that very quickly by these domestic proportions. In the United States this year, 2010, the year just passed, the ODA spend will be 2%, was 2% of the public government health spend. And it was 4% of the defense spend. So modest proportions, but likely to get pushed down by the Republican Congress because of the deficit anxiety and the deficit reduction measures. In the UK, much more challenging. In 2010, the ODA spend was 8% of health and 24% of defense. And if you project forward on the coalition's own numbers, which, as you well know, show departmental spending falling, except for the NHS, which is flat, and DFID, which is strongly upwards, by 2013, the government's numbers suggest that ODA spend will be 10% of health and an extraordinary 33% of defence. Now, I wish DFID only the best in this effort, and I think Andrew Mitchell is a very skilled leader who can make these arguments effectively. But the public backlash to this will be loud and it will be strong. And this will be a hard act to pull off. And partly because of that, to be able to say that the UK is in the lead from this undoubted moral high ground, being alone among all the wealthy countries in maintaining its ODA spend upwards. Britain is unique and alone in that claim, to use that moral high ground to say, but we have to make sure that the dollars and the pounds are spent more effectively and that we have an aid industry that is really fit for purpose in the 21st century. This is a bold agenda. It will be difficult, and Sir Frank could teach us a few things about this. In 1929, Sir Frank demonstrated his prototype to a clearly very arrogant professor of aeronautics at the University of Cambridge, who commented, "Very interesting, Whittle, my boy, but it will never work." 12 years later, the first jet-propelled flight, RAF Cranwell, the 15th of May, 1941, and Pat Johnson, Frank Whittle's longtime friend and collaborator, in amazement on the side of the runway, said, "Frank, it flies." To which Sir Frank said, "Well, that's what it was bloody well designed to do." And I hope that in 2030, someone will say, the aid industry really works, and we can say, well, that's what it was bloody well designed to do. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a few minutes for some questions and answers or statements and no responses. I'm sure we'd be delighted. Sir.
Duncan Mara from the University of Leeds. Duncan Mara from the University of Leeds. Richard, what will it take for aid agencies, principally the bilaterals, but also the multilaterals, but the bilaterals, because that's one agency, one government, to make these changes? How can, for example, as we're here in London, DFID become much better at its job? And when will it have these grown-up conversations with what you call its client countries, the recipients of aid? When will it say to India, well, if you're going to take $1 out of the health ministry for every dollar we put in, we won't actually put in any dollars? When is this sort of maturity going to take place, and how can it happen? Because, as you know, civil service, well, okay, this is a a bold, probably wrong statement, but civil service, you have very clever people at the top, but you have a lot of mediocrity, and the force of mediocrity often prevents radical change of the type that you propose.
Yeah. Well, I have no, it's a great question, Duncan, and I have no magic answer to that question. I think, I do believe that the global financial recession, the PIIGS, the PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain are dropping out of the aid industry rapidly. Other countries are under severe pressure. The aid dollar is going to get scarcer. And I think it is a circumstance in which radical thinking about how best to spend the possibly smaller amount of money that is collectively available is very timely. So I think there's a moment in time to be exploited, firstly. Secondly, I think the UK is in a unique moral high ground position, at least for the time being, and could well exploit it. And it's got a lot of very smart thinkers on these subjects, both in universities, think tanks, and within DFID itself. And thirdly, it actually isn't anything that any one agency can do alone. It does take a degree of holding hands and marching together. And that's one of the things that causes the endless delay, that people have got to more or less agree on the need for some radical change before there is the emboldened kind of lockstep progress that can be made. And that is quite an impediment to the first major moves. But I do think there's a coalition of like-minded thinkers beginning to form. And of course, within that are not only the donor governments, and the donor governments that are worrying about these issues, but also, very importantly, organizations like the Gates Foundation, and in this country, the Wellcome Trust. I mean, there are some major private sources which could also oil the wheels of this debate and oil the wheels of this reform.
Margaret.
Thanks very much. Margaret J., House of Lords and Overseas Development Institute, really continuing that point and asking you a subsequent question. Do you, have I got it on? Yes. Yeah. You mentioned China, which is obviously an extraordinarily important player in all of this. The problem, it seemed to me, when I've been involved informally and formally in these attempts at grown-up discussions with countries in either the BRIC area or others, is that if countries like this one, as you say, taking some position on the moral high ground at the moment, attempt to influence within those countries, China will just move in with absolutely no qualms about any of this. Yep. And I've seen this, for example, very recently in Malawi, where an attempt to have, I think your phrase is right, the grown-up discussion simply led to the Malawian government moving straight to a bilateral agreement with China on what it was they wanted, with absolutely no constraints at all.
Yes. Well, I think, I think individual donor countries, have to decide for themselves their own destiny and which way they want to take their aid programs. And the conventional donors, as represented in the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, have to collectively move in whatever direction they want to move. China, as you said, and I also mentioned, is, I would say, gleefully sweeping aside the carefully orchestrated discussions and agreements. And in anything that other donors decide to do, they must take account of that. And China's going to continue to do that. I mean, China is going to invest for its own purposes in African infrastructure in ways that have far fewer checks and balances and carefully thought out architecture than the ways that we invest, although potentially open less room for some forms of corruption, because it is Chinese money to Chinese company to actually build the road, build the Chinese road, if you like. It is a more direct way of funding. I'm not going to suggest that there isn't other things going on in some places. But a very difficult challenge, and perhaps another impetus for us to reconsider our own ways of doing things.
Alec Braz.
Alec Braz, Fellow of this Academy. This leads on to the debate that I think has been had around the Gates Foundation's priorities, that quite simply put, from the engineering point of view, we might save many more lives by cleaning up the water than by all the drugs for AIDS and malaria. Is this not all part of an integrated part of this situation with China, etc.?
Well, the Gates Foundation has become a major player and is spending a few $1 billion a year out of the total annual ODA spend of $120 billion a year. So one shouldn't exaggerate its scale or influence, but it is influential, undoubtedly. The Gates Foundation has chosen its priorities and the things that it wishes to invest in, and that's quite technology-centric. And I support that. I mean, I support their right to choose what to spend money on and to defend against an argument that they should spend money on everything. I mean, I think they're more effective by making choices. Their choices are largely technical ones, including a good deal of investment now in improved technology for water and sanitation. That's come more recently, but it is now coming. But a lot in health, a lot in education, you're perfectly right. What the Gates Foundation have tried to keep out of, and I think quite rightly, is large-scale implementation, because then they become just another aid agency and are in these same dilemmas about substitution that I've been, and poor implementation capacity that I've been mentioning. In a way, the Gates Foundation come closer to the investment in global public goods. A new drug has a value for the world and will be taken up differentially at the speed that countries can take it up. A new water technology has a value for the world. So new science, new technology, that's where most of their money goes. And I think that's probably a wise choice for a foundation.
So, Brian Cantor.
Thanks. Brian Cantor, University of York. So, I'm going to make a comment. I'm not very knowledgeable about the aid industry, but I'm going to comment upon your last point. And I think it goes to the issue which I've just heard about to do with specific bits of the aid industry, whether it's China or whether it's Gates. So, if you want to do what Whittle did, and in 20 years' time be able to say, well, that's what it was bloody well designed to do, you need to have someone who's doing the designing. And I guess what I want to know is where's the mechanism for designing something on some sound, I use the word slightly hesitantly here, engineering principles. I mean, I think there should be sound engineering principles, but some sound principles, let's say, because it's a very broad political question of design. Where's the mechanism for achieving a sensible design? Instead of having Gates going off doing its bit, China doing its thing, limited things, which no doubt in their own way are very good, DFID doing its thing, which don't add up to a sensible sound design. Because if we could get that, we might have a chance of being able to say in 10 or 20 years, well, that's what it was designed to do, and we had some success.
It's a great challenge that you make. It may be that in the 21st century, grand design is just not possible. There are too many powerful actors who will march to their own drummer, that a grand design will be beyond our grasp. It also may be that a grand design, which of course can always be wrong, wouldn't be the best outcome, that more of a competition for ideas, a plurality of approaches, creative tensions are more in the interests of global development broadly. I think what individual parties can do, be it the Gates Foundation or DFID or USAID or the Swedes or whoever, is to say, we're going to do some things differently. We're going to launch those, demonstrate them, evaluate them, and put them out there and say, this is what we did. and these are the bits that worked, and these are the bits that didn't work, and we're building on that experience. And those who like what they see are free to copy and emulate, and those who don't like it will maintain their status quo. That may be how the system moves forward without the hubris of believing that there is a grand design to be had. And in that connection, the Whittle analogy may be a false one.
Richard, thank you. I think we need to stop. It's a little after, just approaching 8:15. Thank you very much for giving us an evening of thought, an evening of experience, and an evening of aspiration. So thank you for the lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard, thank you very much.